Hello, hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to today's session. So, apologies for the delay in starting. There were some network connection issues that we had. So, thanks very much for joining us. I can see we've got lots of people. Oh, I can see. Whoa, hello, welcome, Mr. Gbemisola. Welcome, my guy himself. Sir, Sir Kofi is the real good man. Me that I'm just looking for like some of the part of like the plots that you have. So just to confirm, are you able to hear me clearly? Just to confirm before we get started, are you able to hear me clearly? So let's make sure that everyone is able to hear me, and then we'll get started. Awesome. Thanks very much for confirming. Awesome. Wow. Okay, so I think that there's like some issue with like Imoh's connection, so I'll just go ahead and get started. So I'll share my screen and then we can get started with today's study. Let's go with share entire screen and share the screen. Okay, so welcome to today's study in the AWS Security User Group, West Africa. So thanks very much for joining us today. So today we're going to be looking at deployment strategies, automated testing, and security automation. So while I was preparing for this, I actually thought to myself, this is quite a lot to cover. So I'm not sure how far we get through the entire topic, but we're going to get some useful information out from today. So if you're here joining us, if you drop in the chat window where you're joining from, that would be very good. So like to keep it interactive. So let's know where you're joining from, and we're going to highlight that on the screen. So just drop where you're joining from. So thanks very much for confirming. Hello, Dennis. Hello, Gbemisola. Hello, Basoro. Hello, Sir Coffee. So just put in the chat window where you're joining from, and then we'll get started. So awesome. I can see Gbemisola joining us from Lagos. And I can see Imoh is back online. Awesome. So while people are putting where they're joining us from, Imoh, do we have a gift that
Hello,
we can? Hello, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm back now. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone.
Yeah.
And thank you for joining us for today.
Mm-hmm.
We know Mr. David, who is the most popular professional in our group, and he's going to take us through the deployment strategies, automated testing, and security automation as regard the AWS cloud. So I do enjoy your section today.
Yeah. So we do have a gift, sir, right? We have a gift that we're going to be.
Yes. There's a gift. Of course, there will be $25 AWS voucher.
Okay.
The person that answers question correctly, the one person that answers question correctly is entitled to winning an AWS voucher, $25.
Awesome. So everybody, I hope that you've heard that. So there's $25 AWS voucher for grabs. I will be dropping a question as we go through the study today. So I will be dropping a question. So make sure you pay attention and make sure you're ready to answer question as we go through that. Okay, so let's get started. So what are we going to be looking at in today's study series? Well, we're going to be looking at deployment strategy options. So last week, there was some discussion around CI/CD, but here we're going to be looking at strategies for deploying software and applications. We're going to look at some deployment, some information around deployment configuration. So deployment configuration is a way to specify how we want to handle deployment in AWS code pipeline, but we'll have conversations around that. We'll look at introduction to testing. We'll look at some different types of testing and how those can fit in. So again, as I mentioned, I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to get through with all of this. But I think what we'll do is we'll get started. We have another session tomorrow. We can pick things up from there tomorrow. But let's get started with this. So what do we have on the screen right here? Well, before we talk about deployment strategies, let us remind ourselves of the goal of DevOps. The goal of DevOps is for us to be able to release quality software to end users on a frequent basis. Keep that in mind. There's all kinds of complex definition about DevOps, but to keep it simple, what we are trying to achieve is we want to be able to release quality software to end users on a frequent basis. So that's what the goal. And we want to be able to do that without necessarily having human interaction. We want to be able to do that using automation. So that's what we're looking to achieve. And what you're looking at on the screen is an example of how that workflow looks like in practice. So for example, over here, we have the developers, the people creating the value. Over here, we have the end users, the people consuming the value. We want to be able to get that going. So number one, if developer makes changes to code on their local repository, they're using Git, they make changes to the code, and then number two, they check in the code or they do a push, or if you set up your processes properly, maybe they do like a pull request and they check in the code into the central repository. They do a pull request to the main branch, however you've set up your structure. So number two, they check in codes to the central repository. And number three, continuous integration gets triggered. So with continuous integration, we build the code which contains the latest changes that the developers has done. We test and we validate it. We'll introduce testing later. We'll validate and verify functionalities. And then if everything is good, we can publish an artifact. An artifact is deployable software that we can deploy. So it is packaged and ready for deployment. So deployable software. Oh, I'm not sure why this is like this. Okay, but deployable software that is ready to go. So publish that into the artifact store. Let's clean up the screen. So now in this case, the user is currently using version 1 of our software. Now the developers have written the code for version 2. So currently users are using version 1. Developers have written code for version 2. Now that deployable version 2 code is now ready to be deployed. So maybe we deploy that into a QA environment first. Why would we want to do that? Maybe to run some additional testing. And if all of that is good, then what we can do is we can go ahead and we can release version 2 to production. Want to release version 2 to production. The question is, how do we do that? That is deployment strategy. Excuse me. About to sneeze, sorry, apologies. So how do we get new version of our application into production on an ongoing basis? We need to have a strategy. Excuse me. And the strategy that we employ depends on our business requirement and what we are trying to achieve. So let's go have a look at the deployment strategy options that are available to us. Oh, wow. A lot of sneezing there. Let's go. So apologies for that. So if you sneeze in there, and let's get going. So let's look at deployment strategies. So what strategies do we have to roll out code changes to the hands of our end users? Well, there are 4 main strategies that we'll look at today, starting with in-place upgrade. We have in-place upgrade. We have rolling updates. So number 2, we have immutable updates. We'll look at that. So that is number 3. And number 4, we have blue-green deployment. So these are 4 strategies that we can use to release new versions of our software to the end users on a continuous automated basis. So we're going to look at these 4 strategies very quickly, starting with the first one. But before we get to the first one, let's just remind ourselves of some of the capabilities in AWS. AWS has a service called AWS CodeDeploy. As the name implies, AWS CodeDeploy is the main service that AWS offers for us to release new versions of our applications, for us to deploy new versions of our application. So that service in AWS is called CodeDeploy. CodeDeploy supports a capability called deployment configuration. And deployment configuration allows us to define our deployment strategy. So we can use that to define our deployment strategy. In other words, how do we want to roll out new versions of our applications to production? And the main use case of deployment configuration in CodeDeploy is it allows us to manage the risk. So it allows us to manage the risk during deployment. Because when we roll out software to users, there is a potential risk. So how do we manage the risk? We need deployment strategy, which we define using deployment configuration. So I'll show that to you in a minute, but let's just quickly walk through the options that are available in CodeDeploy. So CodeDeploy supports deployment to different services in AWS. So it supports deployment to Amazon EC2, which is essentially virtual machines on AWS, or virtual machines that we have on premises. We have the agents, the CodeDeploy agents that we can install on our servers on premises, and which allows us to be able to deploy software to them using CodeDeploy. It supports deployment to Amazon ECS, and it supports deployment to AWS Lambda. Let's go to have a quick look at this. And again, remember that as we go through this, remember to put your questions in the chat window. Remember to do that. So, but let me bring up my AWS Management Console. I'll need to sign in very quickly. So I'm signing in off screen because I want to show you CodeDeploy and the options that I'm talking about. Let's go to, where is this? MFA code. Oh no. It's MFA. So it's asking me for my MFA. So let me quickly get my MFA. I will get that very quickly. There we go. Logged into my AWS environment. So if I go to CodeDeploy, so as I mentioned to you earlier, I said CodeDeploy supports something called deployment configuration, and deployment configuration is how we can define our deployment strategy. So for example, if I go to create deployment configuration, if I say web app version deploy, and you can see it says, where do you want to deploy to? You can see that I can deploy to EC2. Let me maximize that a little bit so you can see the screen. You can see I can deploy to EC2 on premises servers. I can deploy to AWS Lambda. I can deploy to Elastic Container Services, AWS Elastic Container Services. So that supports those options. But let's move on very quickly. So, so Dave asked a very interesting question. Dave said, Does it deploy to Elastic Bean? No is the answer to that. However, Dave, Elastic Bean has its own built-in capabilities for deployment. So Elastic Bean has its own built-in capabilities for deployment, which we're going to reference also today in some of our discussions. So not CodeDeploy, but Elastic Bean does have its own built-in capabilities for deployment. Okay, so let's go on. So CodeDeploy supports different deployment strategies for these different platforms. So for example, it supports one at a time deployment for EC2 instances or on-premises. One at a time. What does that mean? You can probably figure out what that means. What that means is if I have 10 EC2 instances that's running my applications, or let's say I have 3 EC2 instances instead of 10, 3 EC2 instances running my application, 1, 2, 3. It's going to deploy to them one at a time. So it's going to deploy the new version. It will first of all deploy it to the first instance. It's going to make sure that it's stable and everything is working well. It's going to perform a health check. Then it's going to deploy to the second instance. It performs a health check. And after that, it's going to deploy to the third instance. And if any of these instances, if it fails the health check while it's doing the deployment, what it does is that it's going to roll back to the previous version. Why would we want to use this option, this one at a time option, whenever we want to ensure availability, right? We want to make sure that there is no downtime when we're deploying. So we don't want to deploy to all of them at once because that means we have downtime. So we deploy to one, make sure it's LD, deploy to the other, make sure it's LD, deploy to the other, and then we roll it out one at a time. So you see this option if I go back to my system. So if I select EC2, you can see that here I can specify the minimum number of hosts or minimum number. So I can go ahead and I can use this to specify something like that. Or if I cancel this, you can see that there's some built-in deployment configuration. So for example, you see EC2 CodeDeploy one at a time. So I can use that to deploy one at a time. The other option that we have is half at a time. Half at a time is also similar to one at a time. The only difference is it's going to deploy to more instances. So with half at a time, if I have 4 instances, 1, 2, 3, and 4, is going to deploy to 1 and 2 at the same time. Make sure that that's stable and pass the health check before deploying to 3 and 4 next. So it's half at a time. So this one allows us to deploy quicker. So we have quicker deployment. However, it is still allowing us. So it is still allowing us to ensure availability. So again, you see that option right here. So if I go back here, you see the option for half at a time. The other option that it supports, so for the other options, so let's go very quickly to the other ones. So for these ones, we have for Amazon ECS and AWS Lambda, it supports Canary deployment configuration. So what is Canary deployment configuration? When do we use that? Canary deployment configuration means we want to deploy to a test group first of all. Deploy to a test group. That is what Canary deployment configuration is about. So deploy to a test group, gather feedback before deploying to a wider group. So that is what that is about. So again, if I go back to the AWS console on my system, so if I go to something like, again, create deployment configuration, if I select AWS Lambda, or if I select ECS, you can see that I can specify Canary, which allows me to specify how I'm going to, which group I'm going to deploy to first, and then I'm going to gradually roll that out. So that is Canary option. It also supports linear option for both ECS and AWS Lambda. So linear option is where we're gradually building up the deployment. So we roll out to 10% of instances. So for the first 1 hour, we're going to deploy to 10% of our instances. So for the next 1 hour, after 1 hour, we're going to roll out to another 10%. So that goes to 20%. After 1 hour, we roll out to 30% of our instances. So that is linear. Linear means we're building up in a linear fashion, in a controlled fashion. So until we cover 100%, we keep doing 10% deployment every 1 hour. So the idea behind this is we use the linear option if we want to monitor for stability over a period of time. So if I'm doing any deployment of an application and I have a requirement where I need to monitor stability over a period of time, and I'm deploying to ECS or Lambda, I can select the linear option. So again, it's going to gradually build up. So you see that if I go back to my console again, if I select the linear option, it's going to say, what's the percentage? So I can say I want to deploy to 10% every, 5,000. That's minutes, every 60 minutes. I want to deploy to 10%. So it's going to gradually deploy every 60 minutes. It's going to deploy to 10% until it covers everything. So there's another option that exists, and that option is supported for all of them. And this is where I have a question for you. So your first quiz question for today, you have about 30 seconds to answer this quiz question. What is the final option that is supported for deployment configuration? So 30 seconds starts now. 30 seconds starts now. What is the final option that is supported? So this is part of the quiz question for today. So put that in the chat window. So I'm looking at the first person to respond. First person to respond. First person to respond. Oh, I can see Ambassador says blue, green. Okay. Oh, first person to respond correctly. So you can only go one try. So put in the chat window. So I'm doing the calculation. We have about 15 more seconds to go. Okay, I see blue, green. I can see rolling. Okay, got blue, green, rolling. People are saying blue, green, and rolling. Remember, there's a $25. And time is up. 30 seconds over. So sorry, everyone. 30 seconds over. And we don't have a winner yet, because the final option that it supports is all at once. All at once, meaning it's going to deploy to all the instances at once. So again, we're talking about CodeDeploy deployment configuration. If I go to CodeDeploy over here, and if I go to under deployment configurations, you'll see that I have Lambda all at once, EC2 all at once, and we have ECS all at once also. So it supports the all at once deployment option. So try better next time. There's another question that's coming, so get ready. So anyways, let's move on. So this is talking about deployment configuration. So hopefully this gives you some understanding of what's supported in terms of deployment configuration. So the whole idea is that we can use these deployment configurations to implement the different deployment strategies that we're about to talk about. So let's go talk about the deployment strategies. Oh, by the way, this is an example deployment configuration using AWS CLI. So in this particular case, what we're trying to do with this configuration, so this is like the JSON of the deployment configuration. And what we're doing here is that we want to make sure that we have like 3 quarters of our application instances have to always be healthy. So in this case, we're defining like the minimum number of LD hosts. We have a minimum of 75%. So that means 3/4 has to be always LD. But anyways, let's move on. So let's talk about the deployment strategies that I mentioned earlier: in place and deployments, and then we'll talk about rolling updates, and then we'll talk about immutable updates, and then we'll talk about blue-green deployments. So in-place deployment. Let's start with that. What is in-place deployment? In-place deployment allows us to do a direct swap. A direct swap. A direct swap within the same environment is what this allows us to do. So we want to do a direct swap within the same environment. In other words, I don't need to build a new infrastructure. I'm using my existing infrastructure. I roll out version 1.2 to the exact same infrastructure. So there are advantages to this. So we'll look at when it's good to use in-place deployments in a minute, right? But one of the things to note about in-place deployment is that there is downtime involved. So potentially there is downtime involved. So because you're deploying to a production environment to the same environment. So maybe after you deploy version 1.2, maybe you need to restart the web service. That's a little bit of downtime that your users may experience. So there's downtime involved. However, it has a lower cost. It has a lower cost because you don't have to maintain multiple infrastructure. You just have a single infrastructure to maintain. So when do you use in-place deployment? When you don't really care about downtime, and when you're, when it's not a business critical application that you don't really care about downtime, and you have, in terms of this, you have like a lower cost with this. So what are some of the benefits? So rapid deployment. So rapid deployment because we don't have to deploy any new infrastructure. So we can quickly roll out the new version of our application. No need to be deploying infrastructure first. Low cost. So low cost because, again, we don't need any new infrastructure. So we're using our existing infrastructure. So it has a low cost. It has minimal downtime depending on our application. So if your application deploys very quickly and you just need to restart the service and it's going to restart in a few seconds, that can be minimal downtime. However, there is still downtime. It is not zero downtime. There's still going to be downtime. It's also supported by multiple services in AWS. So for example, we can use AWS CodeDeploy, the all-at-once option that we saw earlier. We can use the all-at-once option to do an in-place update. So we specify that to the existing infrastructure and just replace all of them at once. So it supports that option. So again, don't forget to put your questions in the chat window. So AWS Elastic Beanstalk also supports a in-place update option. So we can deploy the new version of our application to all instances in Elastic Beanstalk at once. So using its own built-in mechanism. And AWS Ops Workstacks also support in-place updates. So we just update the application in all the stacks at once. So those are the ways that we can implement in-place updates using any of these different options like CodeDeploy, Beanstalk, Ops Workstacks. So let's move on very quickly. So here's an example of in-place updates. So here we have 4 steps that I'll take you through. So step number 1 here is we create a new version of our application. So in that case, we have a deployable application, and then we have an AppSec file. So here is another question for you. The first person to answer. So let me actually bring up the timer. So here's another question for you. So timer. Okay, so stopwatch. So we're going to give stopwatch of 45 seconds. What is the AppSec file? What is the purpose of the AppSec file? So start. We have 45 seconds to answer that. What is the purpose of the AppSec file? Let's see who gets the answer correctly. So these are things that you may need to know if you're planning to do the exam. Now, what the AppSec file is, what deployment configuration options are supported by CodeDeploy. So you may need to know those information if you're planning to do the exam. So what's an AppSec file? So you have 15 more seconds. Gbemisola said configuration file. Your app config and runtime. Yeah, so configuration file is too basic. So I'll give this one to Abdul Karim Bello. So Abdul Karim Bello, I'll give this one to you. So, yeah, Abdul Karim Bello, I'll give this. So to provide, let's see. Let me see Abdul Karim's answer. Define your app config and runtime. So let me see. Let me think about it a little bit more. Your app config and runtime. That's a little bit of a shaky answer. Let me think about that to see if I'm going to give that to Abdul Karim. 1 minute. So the whole idea of the AppSec file is we determine, so this is our application. The AppSec file is how to deploy the application. Is essentially what it confirms. It contains information on how to deploy the application. That is what this is about. So again, if you're working with AWS CodeDeploy, right? If I go to something like under applications, right? So actually, like I may not be able to show that to you here because I don't have this stuff yet. So let me do tests. I'll show you an example of an AppSec file. Let me bring that up. So if I go to deployment, if I go to create a deployment, so you need to specify this. You need to specify the application that you want to deploy, and then your AppSec file. Your AppSec file, you can edit that in JSON or in YAML. So the AppSec file contains information about how to deploy your application. Let me show you an example of an AppSec file. So here's an example of an AppSec file in AWS. So here you can see it just contains information about, so in this case, it's deploying to ECS, and you can see it contains information about what ports to expose, the name of the application, other properties like which subnets to put the application into, which security group to use for the application. Essentially, it contains information about how to deploy the application at runtime. So also you can specify things like, before installing the application, here's what I want you to do. After installing the application, I want you to restart some services and all this other stuff. So essentially that's what it's about. So let me think about it a little bit more, Abdul Karim. I'm not too sure that I'll take the answer, but let me think about it a little bit more. Okay, let's move on very quickly. So in this case, number one, I create my new version of my application, and I create an AppSec file that defines how I'm going to roll out the application, what is it going to install, what to do before installing, what to do after installing. Then after I do that, number two is that I upload that to either S3 or I upload that to GitHub. So it supports S3 or GitHub. So I upload that to GitHub. And then I go to AWS CodeDeploy. I go to create a new deployment in CodeDeploy, and I reference my AppSec file that's in GitHub. I reference my AppSec file that's in the S3 bucket. Actually, I don't reference the AppSec file. I reference something called the application revision. Application revision is the new application that you want to deploy, plus the AppSec file that defines how to deploy it. So let's go reset. Okay. So anyways, you then go to AWS CodeDeploy, and then you specify the application that you want to deploy and the AppSec file that's stored in S3 bucket or GitHub. And then what will happen is, if you're deploying to EC2, for example, you have the CodeDeploy agent that's installed on your instances. So the CodeDeploy agent is going to reach out to CodeDeploy and say, do you have any new deployment for me to do? If there is one, it's going to pull that information down, right? It's going to pull down the application and the AppSec file, and then it's going to go to GitHub or to S3 to go pull down the version of the application and pull down the AppSec file. So that's essentially what that process looks like very quickly. So let me erase all the ink on the slide. So again, you have 4 steps here. So create, number 1, create the application version and the AppSec file, and then zip them together, upload them to S3 or GitHub. Number 2, create a new deployment in CodeDeploy and reference your application revision, which includes the application and the AppSec file in S3 or GitHub. Number 3, the agent is going to pull the latest information from CodeDeploy. Number 4, the agent is going to pull down the latest application, and the AppSec file that defines how to deploy it is going to pull it down and is going to deploy that. So that's number 4. So let's talk about like the next deployment strategy, which is rolling upgrade or rolling deployment. What is rolling deployment about? With rolling deployment, what we do is we divide our environment into sections, or we deploy our environment into fleets. So the whole idea behind it is we don't need to upgrade or update everything at once. So in this particular case, we update, so we have 4 instances. We have instance 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to deploy the new version of the application to 1 and 2 first. And if that is successful, then we're going to start to roll it out to number 3 and 4. So you can see that it's currently doing deployment to 3 and 4. So that is rolling upgrade. Rolling updates versus in-place updates. So rolling updates has 0 downtime. So with in-place upgrade, we have downtime. So this one has 0 downtime. That's 0 downtime because we don't update everything at once, right? We update a few portions and then update the next portion if the first portion is successful. This allows us to mitigate the risk. So if there's any issues, it's only going to affect the instances that have the new version. And then we can roll back to the previous version. So it's not going to affect the instances that still running the old version. So we're mitigating the risk in this particular case. And there are multiple services that support rolling deployment. We have AWS CodeDeploy. How can we implement rolling deployment with AWS CodeDeploy? We talked about it earlier. We can use the 1 at a time deployment configuration or the half at a time deployment configuration to implement rolling deployment. So either update them 1 at a time or update half of them first and the other half afterwards. So you can see how all of this tie together. But Elastic Beanstalk also has its own deployment options that we can use to implement rolling deployment. So it supports the rolling option and it supports the rolling with additional batch option. What is the difference between rolling and rolling with additional batch? That is my next question for you today. There are no easy questions today. Ladies and gentlemen, no easy questions today. So let's go reset this. Let's start. So I'm going to give you 1 minute for this. Let's see. What is the difference between rolling and rolling with additional batch? So again, no easy questions for you today. Today is all about, you've got to be ready. Got 1 minute. The difference between rolling and rolling with additional batch. Just put a sentence to describe it in the chat window. What is the difference between rolling and rolling with additional batch? Awesome. I think we have the winner of our prize today, Sir Imoh. So congratulations, Abdul Karim. You're the first person to answer the question correctly. So, Sir Imoh, I think we have a winner.
That is good. Wow. Okay, Abdul Abdul Hakim Bello. So he's the winner, right?
Yes, sorry, apologies. It's Abdul Hakim, not Abdul Karim. Sorry, Abdul Hakim. Yeah, is the winner.
All right, all right. Abdul Hakim, please do send us your details to an email. This is the email to send us your name, your full name, your LinkedIn profile, and your Twitter handle. Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Abdul Karim, take the information that Imoh provided and send us your email, your name, your email, your LinkedIn profile and Twitter handle, and we will send you a $25 AWS credit that you can load into your AWS account to do some practice for your AWS learning. So congratulations to you, Abdul Hakim. Well done. So Abdul Hakim's answer is absolutely correct. Rolling with additional batch is going to create new instances before deployment. So the whole idea with rolling with additional batch is this. We don't want to lose capacity while we're deploying. So what we're going to do is, if we have 4 instances, before we start deploying, we're going to create new instances first that we can use to mitigate the risk. So that's the whole idea behind this. So let me bring up my pen. So in this case, it's going to deploy new instances. And that way, it can maintain the existing capacity while it's rolling out to the new one. So that way, it's not as if it takes 2 of them out of service while it's doing the deployment. It has already created an additional 2 to take over the capacity. So we don't lose capacity while we're doing the deployment. So rolling, we just do normal rolling updates. So it's going to take 2 offline, update them, and then put them back online. But with additional batch, it's going to put 2 online, take 2 offline, and then put the 2 back online, and then take the next 2 offline. So that's how it works. So well done. Well done, everyone. So that's how we can implement rolling deployment with Beanstalk. So what about the third option that we talked about? Immutable updates. So Obasoro says there is no downtime in additional batch. So actually, Obasoro, there is no downtime with both additional batch and rolling. So both of them don't have downtime. But the difference is with rolling with additional batch, we don't lose capacity. Okay, so immutable updates, what is that about? Immutable updates is when we want to replace our infrastructure. That is what immutable update is about. So it means we have a disposable environment. A disposable environment, right? So what that means is we want to replace our environment completely. So anytime we roll out a new version of our application, here is version 2 of our application, we deploy a brand new environment for that. And we'll replace the existing environment for that. Obviously, this is good for keeping things in sync. However, it is, it also involves a lot of work that you need to do, right? To make sure that you can automate the deployment of your environment at any time. So that's the work that you need to do for immutable updates. And then finally, we have blue-green deployment, which many of you know. So blue-green, I have an existing environment, and then I have a parallel environment. And then whenever I'm ready, I can switch my routing to the other environment. And we can switch the routing using DNS. We can do that using load balancer. We can do that using EC2 Auto Scaling. So I'll just talk a little bit about that, and I think we may have run out of time today. So here's an example of basic blue-green deployment. So in this particular case, we have both the blue environment and the green environment running the same version. So in this case, we roll out version 2. We begin to roll out version 2 to the green environment, but there's a failure that we've encountered. In this case, nothing is impacted. No one is impacted because everyone is still accessing the application from the blue environment. So no one is impacted. If our deployment goes smoothly and rolls out to all the instances, we can switch our Elastic Load Balancer we can modify that. So we modify the target from the blue group to the green auto scaling group, and now we've rolled there. And if we need to roll back, we just simply make that change in the other direction, and we roll back to the blue group in case we need to roll back. So the services that we typically see in the blue-green deployment: Elastic Load Balancer to balance traffic between instances, also scaling groups. Amazon Route 53, we'll see an example of that in a minute, and EC2 Auto Scaling. Let me show you an example of that because of time. So here's an example of blue-green deployments using Route 53 to manage the process. So in this particular case, the application endpoint uses Route 53 DNS endpoint. And at the moment, it's currently pointing to an Elastic Beanstalk, which is hosting our web application tier, so which is currently the blue. So to deploy a new version, we provision a new Elastic Beanstalk with the version 2 of our application, and then we can run tests against that environment. Once we're sure that our application is LD, then what we can do is we can begin to modify the routing in Route 53 so that we begin to send a small percentage of traffic to the new environment. So we just modify the routing in Route 53 to do that. So we begin to do that gradually. And now we gradually begin to increase the percentage. So we're gradually cutting over. So in this case, we increase that to 30%. And now we increase that to 60%. And once we've confirmed stability and functionality and all of that is good, then what we'll do is we can go ahead and we can decommission the blue environment in order to save cost. So that's an example of using Amazon Route 53 to cut over for blue-green deployment. But apart from using Amazon Route 53, we can also implement that using Elastic Load Balancer with Auto Scaling Group. So in this particular case, essentially this is a scale out, then scaling. So here we have a new Auto Scaling group, and we have the current Auto Scaling group with version 1 of our application. We have a new Auto Scaling group with version 2 of our application. And then what we can begin to do is we can gradually scale out here and then gradually scale in for this one. So in this case, we begin to scale out. So now we've added more instances here, and we're beginning to decommission some instances here. And then we gradually begin to do that. So we've added more instances here, and then we're beginning to decommission more instances here. Up until when we completely decommission all the instances here, and we have all our instances in the new auto scaling group, right? So that's another approach that we can use to implement blue-green deployment. So using auto scaling group with EBA, with Elastic Load Balancer with ALB, or implementing Route 53. Benefits: zero downtime, right? We can customize how we roll out. We can pause. We can deploy to 10%, pause, roll back again, and deploy again. So we can fully customize how we roll out. It's easy to roll back. You just begin. So if you want to roll back, you just gradually begin to scale out on the other hand again, and you can begin to scale in this one. So that's how you can do that. And it's also supported by multiple tools in AWS. For example, we can use the one at a time option or the half at a time option to also implement that in CodeDeploy. Elastic Beanstalk also supports blue-green deployment. So like the example that we showed earlier, same for Upswalk stacks. And then in order to provision the resources that we need, we can use AWS CloudFormation. So I'm looking at the time now, and I don't think I'll be able to get into testing today. However, I'm also taking the session tomorrow. So what we'll do is we'll pause there for now, and then we'll pick things up from there tomorrow. I'll talk about testing and DevOps, and I'll also talk about security testing, and I'll also see if I can cover the topic for tomorrow. But for now, I think this will bring us to the end of this study session. Hopefully, you got one or two useful information. Thanks very much for joining us. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to join. If you're not aware, please be aware, there is an AWS Community Day West Africa that's going to be happening in August this year. It's going to be live in Lagos, Nigeria. Sir Imoh, is there anything that you want to add with regards to the upcoming Community Day event?
Yes, the Community Day event, I will drop a link for us to register. In case you are not registered yet, just now, a minute, let me get the link.
No problem, sir.
So, the community event and it's taking place in Lagos. Yeah? And it's an event that's happening across the West African region. I expect them to be there, even if I'm not in Nigeria. And discussion event, so you can register here and ensure that you bookmark and save in your calendar. Thank you very much for joining us for today's section. We shall continue tomorrow with Mr. David also speaking.
Yeah, and that the event is going to be awesome. So, ladies and gentlemen, Sir Imoh himself will be there live and direct. We have Sir Imoh himself, our community leader, will be there live and direct. You do not want to miss this event. It's going to be an in-person event. It's going to be packed full with amazing sessions. So, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy the event. So thanks very much, Imoh, for putting together the event and for organizing it. Thanks very much.
Welcome, sir. Thank you very much too. And thank you for our audience and participants. Thank you for staying committed from the beginning of this study series in April. Okay.
So thanks very much. I'll see you all tomorrow. Have a lovely rest of the day.